Well, thank you all for joining us, and we're going to have several who may be joining us online and others who will view this presentation when it is uploaded. 2 weeks ago, we had 25 present. We had 11 join us online at that time, and we've had over 150 who have watched the recording of Landon from 2 weeks ago. The last time I checked, I don't know if more have since then. So certainly this has been successful, and I appreciate all of you being here. Appreciate especially our guests who are with us. As we get started, I want to introduce our speaker. Jon Coyle has been part of our extended family for many, many years. He is a deacon at our congregation. He served for many years as a Marine, and so is, how many years? 4 years as a Marine. He is someone who is very interested in history and politics and the Lord's church, and bringing all of those together, he will be providing for us a review and analysis of the 1776 report.
Adjust my screen a little bit here. Center it up. Okay. So welcome everybody that's joining us online. Welcome everybody that's present tonight. When I was trying to think about how I would begin this presentation of the 1776 report, one of the things that came to mind was how we take for granted a lot of times just our way of life, where we came from. Most of us were probably born here. Most of us are probably students of history and students of government. And because of that, the things that are in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, they all just kind of make sense because we've always grown up with it. But have you ever been in a situation where you've had to try to explain things about the founding of our country to somebody who was unfamiliar with it? This actually happened to me a few years ago. I think it was in 2014. And so I wanted to begin with this story. So the company I worked for, it's an engineering firm, and we had built a machine to test cars for a car company in China. And so we had 2 clients come in from China to, when the machine was almost finished, to do the final certification. And while they were here, members of our team, we would take turns entertaining them. And so it was my turn to entertain them. So I wanted to invite them to the house. So they came to the house, we had lunch, and then later we were going to go to the Columbus Zoo. One of these guys had been to the States before. Another guy was his first time in the States. Andy and Jen, those are their names. And so we had a nice meal. And as we were about to leave, Jen was looking at some of the things that were on the wall in the hallway. And I'll bring up the slide of what that is. He sees this old document that is framed on my wall. And this document was given to me by a friend of mine a while ago. And this document was, it's from 1782. So really just after the Revolution. And it's a document that, that is chronicling the transfer of currency signed by Robert Morris, one of the financiers of the Revolution, and some provisions to the state treasurer of the state of Connecticut. And so Jen, he sees this and he asked me, he would always call me Mr. Coyle. That's my dad's title, but he would say Mr. Coyle, what is this paper? And so I explained to him what it was. And I explained to him that at times when I see this document, it reminds me of the founding of our country, where we came from, what the country stands for. And little did I know that that discussion or that question of his would pop up, or different questions would be popping up through the day that could tie back to his first question. So we get to the zoo, and as we're about ready to go into the zoo, I pull out the zoo pass. Family's going to go in. He's going to go in. Andy's going to go in, and he sees the zoo pass, and he says, "Oh, that's very nice for your government to provide you with such a pass, so your family can enjoy this zoo." And so I explained to him, well, that's not how it works, and I explained how the zoo pass worked, and he seemed to understand that. We go into the zoo, and it wasn't long before we encountered a group of Amish people. Not uncommon at the zoo, not uncommon in Ohio. Probably interacted with plenty of Amish. He was staring though, and I could tell that he just wanted to ask me something. So he waited, at least politely, until there was some distance, and he says to me, "Mr. Coyle, what are these?" And then he paused for a while. "Traditional Americans." And so I said, "Well, Jen," and I started to explain as best I knew the Amish, their beliefs, and especially their simple lifestyle, and what they've chosen to do, and how here in America you can do that and you don't have to worry about the government getting on your case about it. And so we went through the day, and then on the way home, this is where the huge discussion came in. This is where the discussion came where he couldn't quite understand what I was talking about. We were driving, and I pointed off to the side to the shooting range that I would go to periodically to go target shooting. And he wanted to know what a shooting range was. So I started explaining to him. He was very confused, and he wanted to know, like, did I own a gun? He wanted to know how many people owned guns, and there's this building that people will go to shoot things, and it was all very strange to him. And then he asked the question, how does your government trust you to own a gun? And I just kind of laughed a little bit. I said, well, they probably don't trust me or anyone else to own a gun. And then he said, so how are you able to do this? And that gave me an opportunity to talk about the things that happened in the 1770s and 1780s, and how the Second Amendment is in our Constitution. It gives us the right to keep and bear arms. And if the government wants to try to take away rights, this is basically our last line of defense as an individual to secure those rights. He couldn't understand it really at all. We talked about concealed carry, which was really strange to him. The fact that there could be people, and there was people, walking around with concealed weapons. He wanted to know how many guns there were in the country. And at that time, there was well over 300 million guns in the country. So as I'm explaining all of these things, which to me were just natural because I've grown up here, and especially if you've grown up in a rural area, it's, most everyone owns a gun and owns multiple guns. But the best I tried to explain it, and explain it from a position of securing those rights, those inalienable rights, he didn't quite understand it. And he didn't understand it mostly because of where he was born and his interactions with the government, and just all of that. So here we are with the 1776 report, and I want to begin talking about the book by reading parts of the Declaration. The Declaration begins, a unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is how the Declaration begins. And as Christians, it makes sense to us, the mentioning of the Creator God. And especially speaking of all men being created equal. This makes sense to Christians. We believe this. We have believed this. We will continue to believe this. So in the 1776 report, I guess we'll talk about the purpose of the report. So on Constitution Day of 2020, so almost 1 year from today ago, President Trump formed a commission that had several purposes. And those purposes were to advise the president, the main purpose, the first purpose, to advise the president of the United States about how to prepare for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in July 2026. 250 years seems like a long time, but when it comes to the course of history, and especially governments, it's not that much time at all. It's not that much time at all. The second is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union. It was also to remind Americans of the history of our founding, and then also, and I think this is key, to report an accurate and honest assessment of the founding of the country, which not only includes the great principles that have made the United States one of the most consequential and inspiring stories in human history, but also includes the imperfections and the stains upon American history, including slavery and racial discrimination, and any assessment of our country's founding that omits either the stains or omits the great things is not an accurate report. It is not an accurate report. It is not an honest report. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were made, the words were penned by men, fallible men. And so in the execution of those things and the striving toward those principles, there are mistakes that have been made, and those mistakes should be not only pointed out, but also looked at and seen if they've been rectified or if we're on the road to rectify those. And we always have to ask a question, and the book asks this question: why is it important to be reminded of the country's founding? And why is it important to report an accurate and honest assessment of the founding of the country? So when we think of the founding, when we think of the Declaration of Independence, there are particular foundations and anchors. We also, in Christianity, we also have foundations and anchors. We have foundations and anchors to our faith. In our Christian life, whenever the question arises, how should I then live? where do we go? What do we do? We look back to the foundation. We look to the Bible for answers. In the same way, great Americans in our history, they also looked back to some of the foundational principles of the United States, especially when the United States or people in the United States were not living up to those standards. And that's certainly happened at times throughout our history. When Christians read the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," we understand what those words mean. We understand them. One way we understand them is through Galatians 3:28. And that is, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's no male and female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. This stuff makes sense. And this is kind of where I was getting at the beginning with my experience with Jen. You know, we understand this. We understand it very well, but there are people on the outside that don't understand this. And we need to aim to try to communicate that to them. We understand that the source of equality comes from a power higher than man, comes from the Creator. And this was acknowledged and stated in the Declaration of Independence. There are several great Americans that have looked back to the Declaration in order to hold Americans' feet to the fire when it came to living up to those principles. And one was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for civil rights. Some of his words: "When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Two others, and it's not just limited to these three, but the book highlights these three because of their effect on American history. Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, calling for women's suffrage, read word for word the same parts of the Declaration of Independence with one small addition. And the small addition was that all men and women are created equal. Again, it was looking back to that foundational document, the Declaration of Independence. And then the last example, Frederick Douglass, former slave. If you know some of the history of Frederick Douglass, for a long time, he did not like Abraham Lincoln. But after he met Abraham Lincoln, he changed his view. But listen to what Frederick Douglass said. And this is from his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" He said, "The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny, and indicts American society for its hypocrisy by recalling the Declaration of Independence when he said, are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us." These three individuals, what were they looking to do? Were they looking back at the founding of our country and saying, let's burn it down? They weren't saying, let's burn it down. They were saying, this is true. Now let's live up to those truths, right? That's what they were looking to do. So what made the Declaration of Independence so radical? Why was it different than what had come before. One of the things that the book highlights is the divine right versus the laws of nature and the laws of God. So what was divine right? The divine right of kings. Essentially, if you were a king, you would be able to say, I'm a king because God put me here. And because God put me here, I can do what I want. That's essentially what it was. God put the king there. So if you weren't a king, oh well. Whereas the Declaration is saying, no, we're not, the divine right of kings is not what is correct. We are appealing to essentially the boss of the king, the creator. The laws of nature and the laws of God appealed to the higher authority, stating that the monarchs were able to do evil toward their subjects, and it was the moral duty of the subjects to break free of the monarchs when this was taking place. And this, of course, is listed later in the Declaration of Independence. All of these complaints, things that the king is doing. The Declaration didn't seek to replace one tyrant with another, but rather it was giving the moral justification as to why the people would rule, appealing to God. And this was very, very different, very different. Up to that point, if you were a monarch, you had full power, and the only way you lost your power is if someone else came along that was more powerful than you, that would take your power away. Whereas the colonists were saying, we're not saying that we're going to be more powerful than you, and that's why we should rule. They're saying we should rule because God, the creator, is the one that's in charge. Again, the Declaration states a moral justification for breaking away, appealing to God. And then again, we come down to this saying. It's been said many times. Hopefully it's said many, many times throughout the rest of our history. All men are created equal. Societies back then, similar to now, divided into classes, into castes, things of that nature. It's different now, though, than it was then. Now, we can look at each other, and we do look at each other as equals, or at least we should. Back then, there was a system. There was the nobles, and there was the peasants, and that's just how it was. And different people were, at least they felt, that they were superior and other people were inferior. Not so with the Declaration. It's saying that all men are created equal. And again, it harkens back to what I was saying before in Galatians 3:28. The Declaration of Independence gave us the moral justification of the people ruling, but it didn't tell anyone how to rule. There was no practical application. How is it that these inalienable rights that were stated in the Declaration, how are they secured? How do the people keep those rights? How do they keep the rights within themselves and not get them taken away? That's where the students of history will know that the Articles of Confederation didn't last that long. I like to call it, prototype work in an engineering firm. We do prototypes sometimes. You get the working prototype, it kind of works, needs some polish to it. You work out the bugs, and then you come up with, phase 2. Sometimes it's phase 3 and phase 4. So the articles were prototype, and then the Constitution was the, final draft, if you want to call it that. But the idea being, how do you secure these rights for the people? And so I throw the question out there. How does a new country honor and implement the principles on which they declared their independence? And this is where, and the book talks about it a little bit with the Constitution, it's actually an amazing thing that happened. The fact that they were able to come up with this Constitution that has been able to last as long as it has is quite amazing. And a lot of times I think we take it for granted. I certainly take it for granted. But it's been almost 250 years that this has lasted. One of the fundamental principles of the Constitution is the rule of law. The rule of law is superior to men. And that goes back to this divine right of kings, where the king says the words, and that's the final authority. Now, instead, it goes back to the rule of law. We have a reverence for the rule of law. The Declaration called the king out on several specific wrongs, rights that were being taken away from the people. The Constitution, when it came in, it sought to figure out how that wouldn't happen again, either from the king or from the people, because the people can take it away too. And how did they do this? How did they do that? Representative government. Executive, legislative, and judicial powers separated. Oh, back one. So with a king, the king was the legislative, he was the executive, and he was the judicial. All three in one. Judge, jury, executioner. That's who he was. Whereas in the Constitution, founding fathers were able to realize that these things needed to have some separation. In order to try to secure the rights of the people, keep those rights, we had to separate out the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So how do we avoid the mistakes of the past when it came to the founding fathers? They wanted a strong government. When they had the Articles of Confederation, the articles were weak. They weren't getting the job done. They wanted a stronger government. But if your government's too strong, what happens? It will take away those rights. So they want to have a strong government, but not too strong. They want a Republican government, but not too Republican. They wanted a representative democracy, but not a direct democracy. They also wanted to thwart the tyranny of majority rule or tyranny of mob rule. So not only were they trying to protect the people from the government, they're also trying to protect the people from themselves or from factions, because they knew that if you had a small faction of people that were motivated enough, those people could take the rights away from the rest of the people. So they had to put in mechanisms to try to make sure that everybody got a say. There was a way to adjudicate disputes and to try to tamp down this possibility of mob rule. And then we have this idea of limited government. When you look in the Constitution, you have articles that tell us what each branch is supposed to do. And then we also see a lot of things in there, but they're not supposed to do. The limitations of what the government can do to us. So again, when you compare it to the divine right of kings, the kings could do really whatever they wanted. Whereas here, there was brakes put on that speeding car that would aim to take away the rights of the people. Separation of powers and checks and balances. Again, quite an amazing thing that the founding fathers did. They knew, because we are people, we're human beings, we are we could be tempted. Some of that human nature needs to be quelled in some way. So they separated the executive, legislative, and judicial, and then they put checks in. Each branch could check the other in different ways. And that way it could slow down any tyranny that maybe the government would want to try to do to the people. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the right to keep and bear arms, the amendment against quartering troops. I don't know if there's ever been a Supreme Court case that talks about the quartering of troops, but I find that one a very interesting one. The search and seizure laws. We have all of these amendments that protect us from the government. And why are they there? They're there because those types of things were perpetrated on the people back before the Constitution came about during British rule. And so we have the Bill of Rights that protect us. And then they also put in the ability to amend the Constitution. The Constitution by itself needs to change over time, needs to change with the times. And how do we do that? We do that through the amendment process. At least we're supposed to do that through the amendment process, I should say. And so the amendment process is one that requires a large majority of people to all agree that this is the best for the country. We can't just pass something because a small amount of people want something. And so we have the ability to change the Constitution, but it has to be an overwhelming majority. And so the changes to the Constitution will happen slowly over time. So what about these challenges to America's principles? All men are created equal. What about slavery? What about slavery? You know, sometimes I have tried to put myself in the position of a slave. I've tried to think, what must it have been like to be a slave? And I think similar to Jen, when we were talking about the Second Amendment, and he couldn't really quite understand what I was talking about. I can't get there when it comes to being a slave. None of us have been slaves. Nobody alive here has been slaves. There is still slavery in the world, so there's probably some Americans that have experienced such a thing, but very, very few that are here now. And we certainly don't know what it was like back during slavery, 1863 and prior. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to think about that. And there is a fundamental disconnect between all men are created equal and this idea that we have slaves in the country, so much so it almost tore the country apart. But again, when you look back, especially to Frederick Douglass, former slave, again, what was he doing? He wasn't saying, let's tear this whole country apart. He was saying, we have a founding principle that all men are created equal, and does it extend to us? Phrase it in the form of a question. It's a rhetorical question, but does it apply to us? Also with slavery, I wanted to tell another story. If you've been to Boston before, there is a cemetery that's right there in the middle of town. I can't remember the name of it. There's several prominent people that are buried there. Paul Revere is buried there. I think Samuel Adams is in there. And John Hancock is in there. And either in front of his plots or in his family plot, there's a tombstone in there. And one of his slaves is buried there. I think the slave's name was Frank. And I remember taking the tour, and the tour guide that was taking the group around, he pointed this out, explained it, offered no opinion, and we moved on. And that stuck in my head. And I, again, trying to think about what slavery may have been like. these founding fathers, there was a conflict there. There was some inconsistency there. But then again, it also makes me think he buried his slave in his family plot, one of his slaves. Like, what was so special about this slave? I don't know how. I don't know how you could have somebody as a slave, but then bury them in your family plot as if they're part of your family. These are the types of inconsistencies and things that I think about. And the founding fathers were conflicted in this regard. But again, the appeal always went back to all men are created equal, back to the Declaration, and then again to the Creator, and then our understanding that all people are created equal. Another challenge to America's principles is progressivism and the bureaucratic rule. We have seen recently the role of the bureaucracy in our society, have we not? Bureaucracy, whether it be in the state or the federal, teams of experts making the rules, people that are insulated from elections that are doing these types of things. And when you go back to the Declaration and you go back to the Constitution, how do we have accountability? How do the leaders have accountability? They have accountability through elections. We can elect them. But as the rise of the bureaucratic state has gotten bigger, that has become a lot more powerful. And these individuals, though many very good intentioned, they are not accountable in an election. Instead, it's a third party. We have to try to elect somebody else that may or may not make the changes. It's further away from the people than was originally intended. Fascism and communism. Those are also threats to America's principles. Communism especially. So for anybody that lived through the Cold War, I was only at the end of the Cold War. My Cold War experience was mostly watching the Olympics and rooting for the United States to always beat the Soviet Union every single time we met on the field or on the ice or wherever. But communism, what was communism? The totalitarian state, the suppressing of religion, the suppressing of speech, the suppressing of almost all freedoms. And then lastly, racism and identity politics. One of the things that embodies the statement, all men are created equal, there's a certain unity that's there. And the Bible does a lot of talking about unity, right? There's a unity in that, whereas identity politics and racism, that's division. So for many years, the racism that was pervasive in our society, it physically divided people. It divided whites and blacks against each other. And now today with identity politics, what does identity politics do? What does it do? It identifies somebody and says, here's what you are, and here's what these people are. You guys are different. Whereas all men are created equal, that seeks to unify. Identity politics seeks to divide. And we know what happens to a divided house. Cannot stand. The book ends, or its last chapter talks about the task of national renewal. And it lists some institutions that will play a part in trying to renew the nation back to the principles of the founding. And the first institution is the role of family. Where does learning begin for a person? begins in the home, begins with the family. Whatever family there is, nuclear family, single parent family, whatever family, that's where it starts. I want to read on page 45 of the book here, the actual words. This is why America's founding fathers often echoed the great Roman statesman Cicero in referring to the family as the seminary of the republic. They understood that the habits and morals shaped in the home determine the character of our communities and the ultimate fate of our country. Strong families, teaching families will cause the country to be stronger. Weaker families will cause the country to be weaker. That is the assertion. We know if we don't teach the lessons of our country's founding at home and reinforce those things, eventually it will pass away. It is our job as family members to pass this on. Talks about the role of educators. There's a big debate with education in the country, public education. And it's interesting, my experience with my social studies and history teacher back in high school, I never knew the way he voted, and I really tried to figure it out. He was able to communicate the material and teach it in such a way that I became a superior history student and somebody that had a desire for the material, but I did not know his politics. I found out later, many years later, he's deceased now, I was sitting at Starbucks in Westerville talking to him, and I asked him directly, like, how do you vote? I just want to know how you vote. And he was essentially a Kennedy Democrat. So we talked about that for a long time. My wife is a social studies teacher. She has several students that do the same thing that I did many years ago. They try to figure out where she stands and what she believes and how she votes. And as far as she knows, to this day, nobody's ever been able to figure it out. And yet, there are kids from both sides of the aisle, and the most vocal ones you can tell from both sides of the aisle have told her that they really appreciated the way that she taught the material. Sadly, that's not the case in a lot of cases. But educators are extremely important. Elementary educators, middle school educators, high school educators, university educators. And if anyone is on the track to be one of those, do not shy away from it. We should not be afraid to enter those institutions, even if they might be hostile to us. We should try to change things from the inside, if at all possible. I listed this, the role of heroes, and I'm digressing a little bit from the book. It does mention heroes. And it seems that these days there are no more heroes left, or the heroes of the past have been marginalized. One of the things that my wife is telling me, a popular thing that social studies teachers will do, and sometimes language arts teachers, they'll have a lesson and it's about somebody, and they'll state who they are and what they've done. And the lesson is, hey, this person, hero or villain? And then you have to give arguments. And that kind of reflects our digital society, right? You're either good or you're either bad. You're either hot or you're cold, or you're black or you're white, or you're whatever. And my wife says, I don't do those lessons anymore. And the reason is because we are a mixture, we're human beings. We are a mixture of good and evil. We do good things. we do bad things. And what is the balance of those things? We can look at our founding fathers and say they were a bunch of slave owners and they were awful people, horrible. There's nothing to be admired. On the flip side, we could ignore that and say, these guys were the greatest people ever. Or we can state who they were, both good and bad, and sort through that and see what the results were from their actions and evaluate it in a more objective way. And then the reverence of law. We need to have a reverence of law. The country stands on law, and when there isn't a respect for the law, lawmakers, judges, law enforcement officers, anyone to do that deals with the law, when we don't have a respect for those individuals that are executing the law, we are upholding the law, we're actually undermining some of the core principles of our country because it's law above them. And by undermining that, we're flipping it backwards. We're putting men above the law. And so we have to have a reverence toward the law. One of the things that the book does not do, it does not get into some of the solutions. Here's what you should do to strengthen your family. Here's what you should do if you are an educator. Here's what you should, it doesn't give those solutions. It just states the institutions by which the principles of the country can be passed on. And so we're at a final thought. We get to the end of this, and what does all this mean? I want to turn from Calvin. Now read it here. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress and therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. What does that sound like? That sounds like today, doesn't it? But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. That's one of these things that